So, Jaron, great to see you again.
Hey.
Wonderful that you came. He doesn't need an introduction. I think most of us know who Jaron is. He's been around Kendall Square and MIT for ages before he went off to do VPL. He was at Atari Research here working with Marvin Minsky, and I was just at the Minsky's house a few weeks ago, and Gloria and Cynthia Solomon remembered you very fondly dropping by and visiting the family.
I certainly remember them very fondly, and next time I'm there, I'll definitely drop by. Yeah, boy, it used to be amazing there because there was that old wooden building left over from World War II that you could just take a saw to and hack your own MIT space, and nobody cared. And there was right on the other side of Kendall Square, there were like just bombed out buildings. It was like a war zone. It was such a different environment. Really quite.
I remember those days. Looks like downtown Tokyo now. It's very different. All
no, I know. It's like it's a completely, absolutely different place. And the Media Lab is like this fancy highfalutin thing. And it used to be. I mean, I was there from before the Media Lab, but MIT was. I think the word I'd use is funky. It was a funky place, and it is no longer a funky place. Yeah.
We try to be funky, but funky in that way. I think our rent went up.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The whole world's rent went up.
I won't say anything else.
You have many whiteboards and laptops, but no musical instruments up in the room.
Those are all in my studio at home, which I think I sent you a picture of. And we have them in Todd Macrover's area. I got a few in my area.
No. I'm just giving you a hard time because I think they should be everywhere and overwhelm every aspect of living entirely. But that's just me.
I totally agree with you, and I love all the instruments that I see. Questions abound. But anyway, I remember being here at MIT in, I think it was the mid 80s, late 80s. You gave a talk when you started VPL. Maybe it was early 90s. I don't remember. You gave a talk.
It would have been early. It would have been early to mid 80s, actually.
Yeah, a room about this size. It was packed, and Jaron gave us his whole vision of virtual reality, and a lot of it was about music too, because Jaron was telling us the reason why he did it was to play musical instruments nobody ever invented, among other things. But just an incredible moment to actually see that. So now we have Jaron with us. He's done many things since. No need to go over all of that, but let's have Jaron talk. I think it's one of the best things in the world. So Jaron, good to see you.
oh, gosh, that's very kind of you. So, and this is a metaverse class, right?
Yes.
So, all right. One always wants to know what class it is. All right, so great. Many things to say. Just now, this notion of playing instruments inside virtual reality was mentioned, which was always an obsession I had. But the reason was I really wanted virtual reality to explore new types of expression where people would directly create a shared experience of stuff instead of referring to stuff symbolically. So it was also called post-symbolic communication. And the idea we were going for was that there'd be some kind of a statistical network that would relate what you do on the instrument to new content that would just be, you'd play reality into existence. And of course, back then, we didn't have big model AI. We did have neural networks, although my mentor Marvin kind of shut those down for a few decades. You probably know the story about that. But I was imagining prompt-based virtual world experiences and content, except from a haptic musical sort of experience rather than a verbal one. And I'd still like to do that. I still believe in that as a possibility, but we're definitely doing it now with language prompts, obviously. And so that's something I'm super fascinated in. And we've done a little bit. We've done a few public demos and a NeurIPS paper and whatnot. You can find on the archive if you want. But here's the basic challenge is that when you go to a large AI model and you say, you know what, I'd like a new college essay because I want to cheat, which I'm sure never happens at MIT. And then it says, oh, okay, I will happily correlate your query with the, 30 million college essays I have access to in the corpus, and here's your essay. Similarly with images, there's just a lot of images to draw on. And lately, even with music clips and soon movie clips already, not whole movies, but soon. With virtual worlds, it's a little different. And there's a couple of problems. First, I want to describe at least my perception of what development has been like for virtual worlds over the years. And, there's some room for disagreement and different interpretations here, but I'll just tell you my impression. And I'll tell it by telling a very simple story. The first time I saw an experiential virtual world that was supposed to teach people experientially something about how general relativity worked, it was about 92, I'd say. And then I would say at a clip of about one per year, or sometimes more than that, people have been reproducing that. And there'll be a new, like, oh, actually, you're gigantic. You're as big as a bunch of galaxies, and you're going to experience being in a relativistic universe. And that's all great, except none of the implementations that are ever started persist. They never persist beyond a kind of a narrow set of circumstances from their initial appearance. And so what happens is somebody gets something working, everybody loves it, but then gradually something about the stack changes, and then a new headset comes out that has slightly different properties, and something about the input devices change, and this and that changes, and it just can't be kept up. It just goes away. Now, that's not always true, but it's very typically true, and especially with really interesting, valuable, unusual, kind of daring virtual world development. And so the stuff that persists requires a little bit more ongoing upkeep, I'd say, than a lot of other kinds of content to keep it available. Like you can watch a video on YouTube that's been up for 20 years and it'll still play. And gaming platforms nailed down enough that you can find emulators that play old games, but you can't really do emulators for VR because the emulator can't be in control of every detail of the actual headset and input device and all this, and the graphics card and all the stuff in any particular situation. So the emulator strategy doesn't really work. There's just too many moving parts. Some of the examples of this problem have really been bad. Like there's a medical school curriculum under development over at our friends at Case Western and the Cleveland Clinic in what is that town called? It's in Ohio. It's called Cleveland, and it's great. Every time I visit there, I really like their work, but it doesn't move anywhere else. Like you don't see it in other schools because people can't quite reproduce enough of all the little details for it to be reliably present all the time. Okay, so I'm telling you the story, which is because I believe that this has been one of the hidden drags on virtual reality over the years, that developers don't have confidence that whatever they make will persist for as long as what they do in other media. So that is an economic reason for prompt-based virtual worlds to become important, because hypothetically, you ought to be able to say, hey, you know that relativity experience, can you make it work in this situation where I am right now? And I think we ought to be able to get to that point where we can do that. So that's the practical reason. But then there's another reason to unite the prompt-based world with VR, and it's more speculative. To me, it's much more exciting. You might call it more spiritual, more challenging. And that is this notion I was talking about before, that if you can change the content of a shared virtual world with other people while you're inside it, then you potentially enter into a new type of communication, a fundamentally different kind of communication. Now, I should say a little bit about this. Now, back in the old days, when I was kind of a fanatical youngster, possibly when I gave the talk that was just recalled at MIT, I occasionally got into this reverie about post-symbolic communication. And the way I used to talk about it was that it would be like a shared waking state, lucid dream that was intentional and also an act of real-time craft and improvisation by the people involved. And also, so it should be unbounded like the contents of a dream or a lucid dream, but at the same time, something you make with intention, like when you talk, and something that's not solipsistic but shared, like the real world, all at once. That was the original idea, was to try to get that combination of qualities. And the motivation for it is partially just because I guess I've just always been fascinated by this curious quality of the human condition where we're both, all of us are both connected and then strangely also not connected at the same time. We connect through our words and our nonverbal signaling, and that can be extraordinary. And yet we are in these separate little, bags of cells, and it's an interesting tension, isn't it? And I've always thought that one way to think about human history, about the adventure of civilization, is that we're finding more and more ways to bridge the gaps between us with inventions like language and writing, and then all the various media technologies that followed. And so that, and there's a further idea I used to talk about, which is there's this danger that if we keep on making technology cheaper and more powerful, at some point it gets so cheap and powerful that some random kids in a basement somewhere can destroy humanity. That's a fear I've been thinking about from my other major mentor from that period, aside from Marvin, was the physicist from California, Richard Feynman, who participated in the Manhattan Project. And his generation was always worried about exactly this, that it's one thing to make a destructive technology that it takes a whole country to pay for, so at least it's not going to proliferate too much. But eventually, what if you can, buy a hydrogen bomb at the local convenience store? Somebody will eventually, set one off, and that's the problem about the future of people and technology. You either enter into some kind of extreme lockdown of people's behavior, or what? How does that work? Because there's always going to be random people who are unpredictable and destructive. So the answer I started to play with when I was young is this drive for ever more technology, for more and more and more, I think is natural. The notion of wanting progress is natural. The notion of wanting betterment is natural, but ultimately the only way for us to experience technological advances is through experience. I mean, like you all these things only become real as we experience them. And so therefore, if you had a machine that could make experience directly, maybe you could create an intense enough form of communication, if you like, an intense enough form of art that would actually become more interesting than the quest for power. So the idea is that instead of trying to get more and more powerful bombs or whatever, you'd want more and more intense art experiences, because ultimately that's all, experience is all you can get at the end of the day. And so that was the idea. So art versus violence, it's not a new idea. But hey, do you know, I can't handle having questions pop up on the screen that I then have to close, because then it totally distracts me. So maybe instead of asking me questions in chat, can we wait? I'll stop before too long. Is that okay? Can everybody do that? Because it just kind of derails me. I appreciate that a lot. I'm not a great multitasker. I'm happy to design technologies that demand everyone else multitask, but me, not really. Okay, so it makes me, Zoom has a terrible UI. I have to manually get up to the screen in order to make the thing go away so I can see you guys. All right. I'm sure there's a way to turn that off. I'm not going to dig it out now though. Okay, so how do you do, I'm just describing to you motivations for wanting to do prompt-based virtual reality. Before I get to the question of what the agenda is like to make it happen, I should say a little bit more about the goals, because as I understand it, there's a kind of a hierarchy of things that are ever more difficult to do with prompt-based techniques. So at the easy end of the spectrum would be simple still image creation. And so that would be the domain of things like Stable Diffusion and Midjourney and DALL-E and the very familiar programs. Then a level up from that is getting objects that are 3D, even if they didn't start out as 3D. And so there's been a lot of effort lately on training big models to turn sketches into 3D. There was a nice paper this week. Some people are feeling like it's already over, but I'm still holding out hope for the whole world of fast NeRFs, if you know what that is, the neural radiance fields. I think that's a really interesting technique that can go further. And so that's also interesting. All right, so then a level up from that is to say you want to populate scenes in a game. And so about a year and a half ago, there was a fashion for the tech companies to demo these things. And here, I'm prime unifying scientist at Microsoft, and typically when I'm not, I don't speak for Microsoft, but I'm going to be just slightly a team player here and point out that we showed a demo where somebody would ask to populate a scene to make a desert island. Like, can I have palm trees? Can I have sand? Can I have an ocean? And this, the stuff would pop up. And then Google and Meta both did demos of prompt-based scene creation. And they also did desert islands. I'm like, can't you do something else? Why did they have, I don't know. Anyway, it's just weird, but that doesn't matter. They're friends and colleagues and whatnot, and former students. But everybody was doing desert islands. And then the question was, well, just getting stuff to appear and saying, well, here's a palm tree and here's a rock is nice. But what a virtual world is really about is interactivity and dynamics and haptics and shared haptics and interactivity. Like there's a whole world of qualities in a virtual world that transcend just having a scene. But then kind of in the in-between spot between just making a scene and getting all the way to a virtual world is gaming, I would say. Gaming is more constrained than virtual worlds, in part because there's a fixed frustrum, in part because gaming systems are locked down. We know all the key parameters to define an Xbox or PlayStation or whatever. And it's a very different and it's got button box interactivity because of the standardized controllers. So everything in it's pretty different. So we moved to gaming, and probably towards the beginning of last year, we started showing Minecraft. And so Minecraft's a Microsoft thing, and it's great for this because the whole aesthetic, of course, is very blocky and low res. So it lets you get away with a lot. So we've been doing all kinds of prompt-based Minecraft stuff, and that worked out pretty well. And that's included prompt-based agents with behaviors and prompt-based, buildings and all kinds of stuff. That was nice. Pretty happy with it. So now we move to virtual reality. So I have a certain set of ideas about what should constitute moving from gaming to virtual reality, what that threshold looks like. Not all agree. But for me, there are a couple of key things. A lot of it has to do with the changes have to be deeply interactive. They have to be unpredictable. They have to be dynamic and haptic, and they have to happen fast enough that the changes happen in the course of an experience rather than first you set up, then you experience. It has to be integrated into the flow of experience. So last year, we set up a test bed, and I decided a reasonable test bed would be virtual tennis or ping pong. I think it's more like tennis. The scale was like you walk around. And then the idea is that as you hit the ball, you can talk to the ball and you can tell it to change into something. And then the other person has a limited period of time to tell either their hand or an object their hand is holding, a racket or something else, to change into something that'll be able to interact with the ball. So everything's on a timer and it's interactive and it has to be synchronized for the players. So it's a good little test bed. And we got a little ways. It's still very early. we had an experience where somebody said, "Ball, you're a salmon," and instead, I thought it would turn into a fish, but instead it turned into a salmon steak. And then the other person turned their hand into a knife and sliced it. In order to slice it, they had to, synthesize code to break one object into two objects, which, there's enough stuff in the Codex Copilot capabilities to pull that off. This year there's more, so actually that if we repeated that experiment, it should be easier now, but haven't done so with GPT-4. Actually, probably should. So this direction is really interesting to me because I think let me mention a couple of other things. I've been describing this sort of visionary future of communication framework, but let me make it a little more concrete and near term. One of the issues that concerns me a great deal is that, and I know many of you are probably interested in this, and I would imagine some of you are doing dissertations on it because of its importance. The more rich and interesting we make our interactive experiences, the more there are chances that we leave behind somebody who has a particular physical or cognitive property that doesn't align well with it. And we have a catalog of these things that we call disabilities, although I kind of object to it at that level because I just think everybody's different. But somebody might be colorblind, somebody might have poor spatial memory or whatever, or they might have exceptional episodic memory or exceptional face recognition and memory or whatever. I mean, they're all just all kinds of things. I'm personally very bad at recognizing faces. I have a moderate prosopagnosia, and everybody has something. I mean, that's just universal. Brains being high performance are also kind of high strung and prone to all kinds of weird little qualities. And so this notion of being able to use prompt-based approaches to just fix an experience for a person to undo those problems on a rolling basis as they encounter different technologies, I think is the right way to go. And I think it's achievable. And in fact, it's just superior. What we do now is we have like these committees that try to say, okay, let's catalog and prioritize disability things, and let's go through all of the products and all the things we do and try to correct for this and that. But it's like, it's really inefficient, and it's a bit of a fiction because real people are all individuals, and there isn't, you really can't do, it's better than not doing it. I'm not saying it's not worthwhile. I'm glad we do it, but I'm just saying one has to admit that there's a bit of absurdity to it. So that's one thing I'm excited about. Another thing I'm excited about is the way software has been for the last 70 years is that it's like really rigid. Like you have to do things pretty correctly. Like if you have some form, you have to enter the form correctly, and you have to enter the URL pretty correctly. And lately there's some tools that help soften the edges in some cases, but overall there's just a lot of times where you see somebody or you find yourself struggling to get some interface just right. I don't know if any of you saw my piece in the New Yorker today, but I was describing the problem of watching somebody in a medical office trying to get something just right in the screen, and what torture it is for them and anyone watching them. And so this notion of having a generally more flexible type of interface has always been desired, but has always been just out of reach, I think, until now. I actually think we're at the point where we can start to change the general experience of computing to be less rigid using the types of techniques I just described. And of course, I'm talking about virtuality because that's my thing, but I think it can apply to all aspects of interface. And the importance of that can't be overstated. Like, as some of you know, in the last 20 years or so, I became a critic of technology, which it wasn't necessarily where I expected to go from earlier in my career, because I really disliked the way people were becoming manipulated or toyed with by algorithms on social media and whatnot. And I felt that was doing damage to society. And we don't have to go into that now, but I'm sure you're all familiar with that world of thought. But the thing is, the reason we got there is in part that people just threw up their hands and gave up at making stuff usable. They were like, you know what? it's one thing to have some kind of a browser for 1,000 objects on your desktop, 1,000, yeah, but once you have like 3 billion objects online, forget it. You're not going to be browsing. So we're going to do recommendation algorithms. And the problem is, as soon as you have recommendation algorithms, they get kind of corrupted because somebody off to the side is saying, hey, if I could just kind of influence that recommendation algorithm, I could use the change to benefit myself. And so you have this giant industry of search engine optimization people and bots who try to add behaviors to the system to reprogram the optimization algorithms, all this like incredibly convoluted nonsense. But what's kind of interesting is with prompt-based techniques, like when you're interacting with GTP4 and you ask it for something, it's really a different situation. All of a sudden, you are able to reasonably address 3 billion objects. That becomes conceivable. And so it can, most people are worried about AI taking power from people, but actually, if we can make the whole interface experience more flexible, this might be a chance to give power back to people, which is not the usual assumption. It's not to say it'll happen, because humans are totally capable of screwing up opportunities all the time, left and right. And yet, we should note that there is an opportunity here to make this better. So that's another reason to care about prompt-based UI. So here, the theme that I hope you have gotten from this talk so far, even though I'm trying to be a little virtual reality specific, but it's a much more general idea, that usually when people think about prompt-based big model AI, they're thinking about content that's spit out. I want my picture or my movie or my fake music cut or Drake in the Weekend or whatever it is today. And or I want my fake college essay. For the stupid liberal arts track that MIT makes me take, whatever it is. So the content, but let's forget about the content for a second and let's talk about the UI itself. If we can use prompt-based techniques to change the immediate experience, the immediate interface of computing, that could have a transformative effect economically and politically and aesthetically, I think. And so it's a somewhat different goal, but I think it might even be a more important one. And it's gotten a little less emphasis. I mean, people work on it, people care about it, but it's gotten less emphasis than the content creation goal. I'm going to stop talking in a second so that you can ask questions, but I want to mention just a couple of other things about virtual reality. There's an obvious one, which is all of you are in some kind of virtual reality class there, and you're undoubtedly very much aware that there's been yet another major VR hype cycle in the last year. If this is the first one you've experienced, it won't be the last. I've gone through a number of them, starting back in the 80s, where suddenly, for whatever reason, nobody's heard of VR before, and then there's like all this stuff, and there's headlines and news reports and all this stuff, and then it kind of seems disappointing after a while and isn't quite making sense, and then it doesn't, it kind of fades, and then the whole thing happens again after a while, because it is intrinsically an interesting concept and people keep on coming back to it. Another thing about VR is that every once in a while, if the stars align, when somebody has a VR experience, it can be really intense and amazing. Like what happened with Facebook turning into Meta, was that Zuckerberg went and had some demos that were just really good and just had this vision like, oh my God, this is it. This is the future. I'm happy people have great experiences, and they should. I mean, I think that's wonderful, but I think there's often perhaps an immediate set of assumptions about what VR can and should be that don't quite work for what it is, especially for people who've had amazing first experiences but haven't really worked with it for years and maybe don't have a lot of perspective. So one of the questions is VR this thing that everybody's going to live in from now on? And it'll be like smartphones, where everybody has their smartphone all the time. So it's just a constant part of life. And so in the same way, will VR be this thing that you're just constantly in? Many assume that is true. I do not. I think it's quite wrongheaded, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I'll just give you a few of the reasons that I think that doesn't work. One of them is that the experience of coming back into physical reality after you've been in VR is so cool that I think people will just keep on wanting to do it. I just think, I don't know if you've had the experience, but after you're in a headset for a while, when you take it off, like all of a sudden, like the world is more textured and faster and more supple and everything. Like it's just, it freshens your senses. And I actually have always thought that's the coolest moment of experience in VR. For some reason, not everyone experiences that, but it mystifies me because to me, it's like a very apparent thing. And the better VR gets, the more intense that difference becomes for me, because the more you start to refine your perception, your sensitivity to the difference. So like you're changing. And this is like the people who say, well, you won't be able to tell between VR and the physical world when VR gets good enough. I think what they're missing is that people are dynamic. Like when you use VR, you're learning to discriminate between VR and physical reality, and you get better and better at it. So you're becoming more and more sensitive. And so if you like, it's a horse race between VR getting more, wider angle and higher res or whatever it might be, lower latency, etc. And your brain getting better at differentiating. And I think in general, your brain stays ahead in that game. And so I think you actually just perceive more and more. And I think that's actually, if not just a wonderful thing, but maybe the best thing about it. And then some of I occasionally compare notes with other people in VR at the other companies about what's going on when they try to commercialize things. So right now, Meta is a kind of an interesting case. I actually feel impressed with how many headsets they've sold, and I think their headsets are just fine, especially for the price point. Others are less impressed, whatever, that's a value call. But when I talk to the people there about what's actually working in their store, their story to me is extremely similar to what I had found over the many other experiences and earlier times I've tried things. One thing is that, and this is a bit of a mystery, it's natural to think that people will want to be in some kind of avatar chat. It's natural to think, oh, you'll want to be in some kind of world where you turn into a creature and there's everybody else there and you interact. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, but I invented avatars. I did the first multi-person virtual reality stuff. Virtual reality originally meant multi-person to distinguish it from single person, which was the virtual world. But anyway, I've been doing this a really long time. And an unusual pattern has emerged that seems to repeat for different people who look at it, which is that there's a minority of the population that persists in avatar chat type situations and a majority that doesn't, and we don't know why. And that's just really interesting to me. Like, for instance, I helped start a thing called Second Life 20 years ago, which is a screen-based avatar chat thing, which is fine, the thing that kind of knocked it was very much in the public eye for a while, and then it got knocked out by the iPhone because it didn't transfer well to the small screen experience. But there's still 1 million people using it all the time, and of those, 1/10 of them are content creators within it, which is, I think, is great. And what's really interesting is they're not the original 1 million people. They've cycled through, but it hasn't grown. And so there's this weird thing where there's this minority of people that really love this modality. I have been really interested in trying to understand why it works better for some people than other people, like crazy. And there's a lot of theories and a lot of ideas. I don't think at this point there's anything that we can say is verified as a theory about that. There are some ideas that have intuitive power, and there's some experiments that are okay, but still kind of preliminary. I think basically we're not sure why that is. But at any rate, there's this kind of curious thing where avatar interaction is really cool for a minority of the population. And it doesn't seem to track any particular other qualities. It doesn't seem to track gender, sex stuff, or education background or culture. It's just like this curious thing so far. The one application that's actually persisted is fitness, and yet to my amazement, nobody's put out a fitness headset that would be like good for sweat and all that kind of stuff. Like, I don't know why. I think just because it doesn't match our ideas of what would happen. Gaming has not really took off too much, and that one surprised a lot of people, especially because the Steam Valve world of gamers was one of the sources of the renaissance in headsets for consumers in the last decade, right? And so you'd think that that would work. And there've been a ton of people who put effort into great games in a VR modality, and a lot of them are great. But nothing's really persisted. We don't have giant, really persistent gaming communities at the scale we have on conventional screens. They're at 2 orders of magnitude less or something like that. And so what's going on with that? Well, no, 3 orders of magnitude usually, actually. So what's going on with that? I have some theories about it, but this isn't science. This is just me kind of intuitively speculating. I think one of the things that appeals to people about playing a game on a conventional screen is that even if it's a big screens are typically far enough away from you that the actual frustum that's taken up makes it kind of smallish, like it maybe is a 25-degree field of view if you were going to measure it the way we measure headset fields of view. And then what happens is when you're playing the game, you're like this big thing looking into this little thing. So it puts you in this superior position. So whatever's going on in the game, whatever worries you might have about whether you're winning or losing, or whether your character might be in trouble or whatever, you're bigger than it. When you go into virtual reality and it's bigger than you, that power relationship changes. And I don't think people like that feeling. I think that's just a very simple problem with headset gaming. It just is the wrong, and same thing we said of cinema. That part of what's great about cinema is that you're at a remove. You can watch the horror movie or the action movie, but you're not actually in danger. But when you're in VR, it's more vivid, and the emotional calculus flips. And so I just don't think people like it usually. There are probably a few who do, but not enough to make the kind of market that people expect from gaming. And so that's just the theory. I think that's part of the issue there. And I have noticed that a lot of the games that seem to pick up some cultural resonance and seem to have people excited beyond the initial days of the release are creative games, tilt brush type things where you're making stuff. And that might be my own bias, since I want it to be a medium of creation, as I was saying before. So you can factor that in. I might be allowing my own hopes to color what I think I see, but I do think I see that signal from people. I should also say a few things that I don't think I need to say to you, because you'll all understand this, but a lot of people out in the VR industry, such as it is, don't understand it, which is that there's been tremendous emphasis on what we've decided constitutes quality image synthesis. So more pixels, faster, fancier shading and all that. And probably in an interactive modality, while that's great. I love that stuff, but probably haptics, interactivity, latency, interactive haptics where 2 people are touching the same object and interacting with their bodies, avatar modification where you turn into different kinds of creatures. It's one of my very favorite things, where you turn into something with different limbs and yet you can still control these weird bodies, because it turns out the brain can do that. All that kind of stuff is much more intense and much more interesting, but the industry is still very focused on graphics. And I mean, in a sense, that's not insane, because obviously the human species is very vision forward. And yet for VR, it does seem a little misplaced and a little like a poor choice. And so I think that's been another problem. But anyway, all of this wraps up into a sense that there was quite a significant hype cycle in the last year, where one of the major corporations changed its name to Meta in order to publicize this sort of work. And yet it doesn't seem to have taken off. And now AI is king. and poor VR is, you know, maybe a little in retreat. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, you never know. All of a sudden headsets might start to sell like crazy this Christmas when, you know, people decide that they miss the lockdown or something. I don't know. But anyway, it it's a bit of a rough time to be entering the field. And I wanted to just give you some advice, which is, if you have a passion for VR, but then there's a sort of a VR winter where people aren't hiring, try to think more deeply. Well, what is it about VR that you care about? If what you care about is supporting people with different cognitive styles, or turning digital interactivity into a new form of expression that might be useful to people, or whatever it is, like try to really pull back and say, what is the core thing? Why did I actually get interested in this in the first place? Then figure out a way to do that. Like recently, when the various companies were facing layoffs, people would call, say, I don't know what to do. My whole VR team is being laid off. Say, wait. You don't do VR. You do AI. Repeat after me. This thing you're doing, it's AI. just you can sort of be a chameleon and morph what you do to fit the fashion of the year, because none of these terms are really that well defined at the end of the day. All right. I guess that's enough for now. Do you have any questions?
No, I'm sure there are a lot of questions for Jaron. Maybe we'll open the floor first. Yeah, you're in the front. Go ahead. Do you have to talk into the mic, or how does this work?
Yeah, this mic, or you can repeat the question. Yeah.
That's good.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great. When I read your book, this idea of post-symbolic communication was quite prevalent, and it's interesting in this as you're talking.
Now I'm having trouble hearing you. I did before, but now it's getting a bit harder. So
I'll just try to speak louder.
you think in a setting like this, video conferencing would work by 2023?
Exactly.
My question was, when I was reading your books, this idea of post-symbolic communication was very prevalent, and now that you're talking a lot about using large language models as prompt-based word generation, I'm wondering how is this moving more towards this post-symbolic communication, or is it moving more?
Moving towards what?
Are we moving more towards post-symbolic communication, or are we moving further away?
Yeah,
from
that's a perfectly reasonable question. I mean, I'm not sure. If you're using language prompts to get content, it's a little hard to call it post-symbolic, because surely language is made of symbols, especially when it's filtered through a big model where tokenizing is like, I've noticed every introduction to transformers for novices spends the first 20 minutes on tokenization and then rushes through everything else in 5 minutes. Okay, we're done. But anyway, yeah, so it's obviously language through big models is the most symbolic thing ever. But that doesn't mean that the result of the overall use of it that I'm thinking about might not be well described as being post-symbolic. I don't actually know. There's not necessarily, I mean, that's your philosophy PhD dissertation right there. You just there you go.
And then if I could follow up with a brief other, John was speaking earlier and thinking about kind of what you mentioned briefly about like kind of the fragility of some of the game development for building worlds within the current platform. Thinking about like with these new prompts, are we able to is this like the new paradigm you're thinking about in regards to making this more accessible? And I was listening to a talk from Sherry Turkle yesterday, and she was saying this thing about creativity and AI, and saying, how do we not ask what computers can do for us, but what we can do with computers? And I'm kind of curious in your relationship and the previous speaker, John's relationship, about when you started making these worlds originally without as much game engines, without as many tools. Are you feeling that there's a more moving towards us asking what we can do with technology, or what technology can do for us? Or is there this disconnect between those two things? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Ms. Turkle. I've known her since whatever, for a long time. And I'll just say whatever she says is right, you know? Hey, I'm gonna paste a thing into the chat, which is my little piece that just got published today in the New Yorker magazine. Take a look at that. You might find that helps answer the question you brought up.
Okay, great.
Okay, come on up.
Hi, my name's Nick. I was curious how much in your course of your study you looked at sort of the prehistory of virtual reality, before pre-digital. And in looking at sort of these hype cycles or the winters and the booms, is there some sort of like a historical or maybe sociological angle on that? For example, like the turn of the century when, stereographic photography was booming and panoramas and world expos and stuff like that. And it was a type of doubling of our experience and sort of telepresence and stuff. And was there something about these eras where these technologies like boom because we're trying to figure out like industrialization or something where we need to go into this chrysalis and then like emerge with a different understanding?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, to me, I not as much as some people, but I've collected a lot of early stereo stuff. I have a whole bookcase of there was this thing that was done about, God, I would 130 years ago or so, of a collection of stereo photographs geotagged around the world with hundreds and hundreds of them that take up a whole wall bookcase, and it came with its own little custom geotag, and so you could go on the bookshelf and find a geotag location and then look at a picture, and they send photographers around, and it's amazing. It's incredible. It's like, 3D Google Maps from the 19th century. Yeah, so what about that? I'm not I mean, I think technology has always gone through a bit of a hype cycle, but not as much as lately. I mean, the thing is that I think there was a while when new technologies were expected to be a little more substantial, because remember during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a very rapid series of technological introductions that were not overhyped at all. Just basic things like, toilets and electricity and refrigerators and all this, like just transformed health and life and lifespans and stuff. And so I think people had a sort of expectation set for new technology introductions. And then I think they started getting hypey and disappointing at some point, because just, there's the tech industry became such a large part of the economy that people had a motivation to hype things. So you start to have your Google Glass or something like that. And I'm not saying that there weren't things like that in the past. There were occasional introductions that just didn't pan out for whatever reason. The Edsel is an example from automotive. It's a little later than the period you're talking about. By the way, in terms of prehistory of VR, the one that I find the most interesting is The Machine Stops, if you're not familiar with it. So anybody who doesn't know about that, yeah, it's a novella by E.M. Forster from, I think it was 1907, but I might have that slightly wrong. And just read it. I won't say anything more about it. Just find it and read it, and you'll see.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Could you come here? It's a little short.
Jaron, I was really intrigued by the comment you made about returning power to the user, to people through these technologies. What are your thoughts on sort of the tension between like the centralized approaches to, running these big, huge language models inside companies versus the decentralized approach of open sourcing it, like the stability model that just came out the other day?
I mean,
how important is it to that?
Yeah, I have to say a few things that'll be unpopular. One is that I think open source will kill humanity combined with AI, and it has to be abandoned as an idea. And what I mean by that is that open source, in terms of the idea of sharing stuff and sharing resources, is great. In terms of the idea that you don't know where something came from, it's not okay. You need, like, open source has been associated with a kind of a context loss and a provenance-free approach to information systems where, oh, I put it in open source and I don't really kind of know what'll happen to it. Nobody, the degree to which it gives you a little bit of a way to trace, but not really that much. And it's really not okay. So, but the other thing about it is that source code is the source code in the big models these days. All right, now I'm going to say something that might lose me some friends. It's not that difficult. It's not that interesting. I mean, the truth is that the code aspect is minor. I mean, I don't want to overstate that. The concept of the transformer solved this issue of how to combine some different types of patterns into one pattern. Order and co-presence, and that was an advance, and there's some other advances like that. But if you actually look at the code, there's just not a lot to it. Honestly, it's about the data. And so one of the issues with open source is that it doesn't necessarily have to favor code over data, but historically, and in terms of all the documents and licenses associated with it, in terms of its culture and all practices associated with it, it's all about code, and code matters less and less. Code is becoming unimportant. Now, what does matter is scale. And so here we have a problem. You need really, let's just say, and here, once again, I don't want to speak on behalf of Microsoft, but if you compare the functionality of GPT-4 to some of the other things that are out there, including the earlier GPTs or other systems that have been forwarded by the other companies, it'll outperform them pretty obviously, especially in specialized domains, if you wanted to pass a bar exam or something. And so why does it outperform them? It's just because it's fucking gigantic. I mean, really, it's just big. And so the question is, how do you make something really big? And the answer is you need some organization that'll spend to make some just gigantic thing, you know? And the way we do it is not entirely public, but just the physical infrastructure and the way to do it that controls its carbon footprint, and the way to do it that still powers it, and the way to do it that makes it reliably accessible requires very serious spending and extreme, like a lot of innovation. Like this, I think whenever it comes out, people will be surprised how much work just went into making these big scale things even happen at all. And so, so you can't, there is an intrinsic way that centralized organizations are going to come to the fore if model bigness remains important. Now, of course, everybody in AI will say, oh, any second we'll have the insights so that they don't have to be as big. Yeah, okay. But for the moment anyway, bigness equals function. And so to the degree that remains true, it suggests either in the future, there'd have to be some sort of governance of a non-proprietary big central thing. And indeed, governments have always done that, but our current ideology is that government is other people, not us. It's stupid and incorrect, but we can't be talked out of it. So that's just the way it's going to be, I guess. And so for the moment, it's going to be giant tech companies, of which there are only a handful that are plausible candidates. For the moment, Microsoft's trying to be a good citizen. The people there are trying to be good citizens. You shouldn't trust us in the long term. Obviously, you can't. Society can't. Something's going to have to give. Yeah. So I guess it's not about. So what can I say? A lot of the alternate big models are cool. In fact, you know, I actually think a lot of the visual output from the smaller visual models, in a way, it's more fun than the bigger ones that we do, because I think having them be a little weird is actually cool. It's what people want. And so if what you want is just weirdness, I think actually a smaller model might get you better weirdness. If you want something that helps you figure out tax law or the right, you know, the the right metal to use in your design for a bridge as a first pass or something like that, you maybe want the big model. You really do. And so that's I guess that's as much of an answer as I think I can do immediately. Should I read some of the ones that are coming up in the chat?
Yeah, oh, sure.
I have a question.
Sure. Yeah, here, why don't you do a question, then I'll do one of the text
Yeah.
questions.
So this question is a little bit related to the joke that you mentioned. Just rename your work in AI, something with AI, and you're good.
Yeah, whatever it is, it's AI until the fashion. Whenever there's the next AI winter, then you're not doing AI anymore. Like you have to.
But there's some
Yeah.
interesting thread that goes between the two disciplines. So I come more from the augmented reality perspective. And
Mhm.
in augmented reality, machine learning is just changing the entire game. Like it lets us see the world so much better than ever before. And then on the other side, in VR, like VR is fundamentally empty first, and you have to fill it up, right? And it's so difficult to fill up 3D spaces. And I think one interesting point for that is like some CEO of some company made some selfie that went through the world, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, this thing is empty and boring." And then on the other side, we have these things like Nerve that help us to depict the world better and kind of transform what 3D graphics is. And I think the question lies somewhere in between there. How do you think 3D graphics fundamentally will be disrupted by this technology and helps us to become an author of a world that kind of, where those two things kind of merge into one stream?
Mhm. Yeah, remember I was saying before that I don't think VR is something you want to spend all day in. I think it's more like a fine wine than a dorm room. Like, I don't think it's like the new place that you just spend time. I think it should be for special experiences. And so I'm not as concerned about getting it filled up, but I'll tell you what we did with Second Life 20 years ago, we had that problem of like, it's all empty. So we created a market for content. And I think what was interesting about our market, which should have been replicated but wasn't, was that you didn't have to just make a whole virtual world. You could say, all I do is hands, or all I do is wallpaper, or all I do is plants, or all I do is the motion of insects, but not even the insect. And then people just did these little parts, and then others could combine, and there were value chains until whole things came up, and that became very productive. So it was a fine-grained market instead of a coarse-grained one, and that filled up a whole planet really fast. And in fact, that initial fill of Second Life created a kind of aesthetic emerged that co-evolved with Burning Man Festival, where it influenced Burning Man and vice versa. So it actually filled up really fast and with tons of stuff. And you could just go and go and go for days in Second Life and hit new stuff. Although, to a degree, you could say, well, it gets a bit monotonous because a lot of it has this character. And you could also say that about Burning Man, by the way, maybe even more so. It's so there are ways to fill things up. But yeah, sure, I agree. AI, if all you want is stuff, if you just want objects, I think the technology is kind of there. I don't think anybody's put together a platform that really does it well at scale, but there's no technical impediment to that.
And maybe it's more about the dialogue between you and the stories that the world around you tell, and that you immerse yourself with and form conversations around. I think that's probably an interesting perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been talking about occlusive, classical virtual reality. We could also talk about mixed reality, and putting stuff in the real world, which is extremely interesting and is perhaps an even better storytelling form and everything. And unfortunately, a lot of the companies that maybe were on the cusp of doing that got really hit bad by the pandemic, because a lot of it was you'd go out, like Niantic or Snap were both trying to do ambitious things, not to mention Apple. And if everybody's staying home, having a big shared mixed reality world is not going to happen because people aren't in the same physical setting to share stuff. So that was kind of unfortunate, but that's how it goes. Maybe I should move to another question.
Go with the chat, Jaron.
Let me start looking, because there's a bunch in the chat. Let me start. In the context of Web3, how do you perceive the importance of identity? So I am all about provenance. I want people to get credit when their art's used as a portion of a big model synthesis of a new piece of art. I think provenance will do more to benefit people than an obsession with privacy. And I say that as one of the people who co-founded the process that led to the European privacy framework. I've put a lot of time into privacy, and I think provenance will serve people more. So I'm very into identity. The question of what identity is and how it works exactly is non-trivial, as we all know. But I think identity might be one of those things where nailing down a precise definition that it's the combination of your DNA and your history and blah, blah, blah. It might be actually hard to get it perfect, but you can get it close to perfect pretty easily. And I think your identity is your timeline. And because maybe in the future somebody can change your DNA or whatever, but I think it's your timeline. I don't think it's your physical configuration. I think it's your history. That's your identity. And I think if we think of it that way, solutions start to come out. All right, the next thing is, do you think humans are intuitively evolving to bridge qualia and become unity? Well, you know, the post-symbolic communication idea is kind of moving to that, right, where you're sharing stuff directly instead of through symbols. But I don't think it's the kind, I think you only sort of asymptotically approach that. I think ultimately qualia are mysterious and outside of our ability to access things technically irrational. I'm a mystical dualist because I've just decided that's the most pragmatic thing. So that's just me personally. I think people are supernatural and qualia are supernatural. You might not agree with me, but anyway, that's where I've landed, because it just makes everything else easier to think about, and it's consistent with all observations. All right, on your observation that users feel small in VR, is there a term for this feeling? I don't know of a term for that. That's a good point. You know, a long time ago when I was young, I made up the terms virtual reality and mixed reality, and they took off. And since then, I've just thought, oh God, I've made enough terms. I'm going to leave it to other people. So is make up something, like maybe it'll stick. Maybe you can get to say I made that up. Why not try? And then it could be I'm not gonna, you can, but you know, instead of doing something Greek, try another culture, try something, you know, that's African or something for the source words. It could be really cool. All right, next. Interested if you could tell us more about Marvin Minsky. Oh, you were there, yeah, in the living room. Oh, that's very sweet. Whoever wrote that. So this is a reference way back when I was, you know, had a startup. So my startups, I guess we incorporated in '83 the first VR startup, but I think it, you know, it really started a little earlier than that. But I would have been in my early 20s, right? And all the guys in this startup, we decided to make a pact that should we ever have children, which seemed like a very exotic and impossible idea. But should we ever have children, we would snap little tiny baby virtual reality headgear on the baby when it popped out. And then at night, while the kid was asleep, keep on swapping in bigger and bigger ones. So the kid would grow up in virtual reality. And then the purpose of that was to create a kid who'd be the world's best mathematician, because they grew up in 4 dimensions, right? And so they'd grow up with 4-dimensional intuition and just tear through all the unsolved problems in math and physics. And so that's the idea. And so then much later, I did have a kid, and I really just couldn't get myself to, not that I had a baby headset on hand, but just the very idea was impossible. And then later, when she was an adolescent, I told her the story, and she got really pissed at me, said, Papa, I could have been the first kid in 4 dimensions, and you didn't let me. What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Oh God. When we did, I have made her all kinds of 4D toys in VR over the years, and some of my students have too. So she's pretty good at manipulating some 4D polytopes and whatnot, and that's kind of cool. But yeah, that's that story. And Marvin, anybody who knows my work in Marvin's will know that we have almost opposite approaches to AI philosophy, and he used to love arguing with me. It was really, we had a lot of fun with that over many decades. All right, well,
Over all the questions.
That's fantastic, Jaron. Great to see you. This is Joe, by the way. We have to get
Joe,
together.
you're out of camera. The camera's
Oh, sorry.
chasing you, but all I see is your elbow.
There.
Oh, there. Hey, Joe.
Good to see you. I hope to see you again in the physical world before long to talk musical instruments. I think we have a whole bunch to catch up on there, looking at your background. Look forward to it.
Yeah, so true, so true, so true. Yeah. Well, come out. Whoever you are, give me a second. Somebody's at the door.
Yeah.
MIT will not wait. Okay, well, I guess I'll say good night for now.
Yeah, great to see you, Jaron. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.